Okay, start of a new week and start of a new unit. So we've seen the French Revolution and the rise and fall of Napoleon. And actually, one of the things that's happening concurrently with that story, with really a lot of the stories we've been talking about recently, with even the American Revolution, is something called the Industrial Revolution. Different historians will place the starting point at different places, but generally speaking, people will say in the mid 1700s, there's this significant change on how industry functions, significant change in how things are produced. And what we're going to see is that it starts in England and actually stays there for a while. As we study the Industrial Revolution, one of the things we'll see is that England tried to, in a sense, keep it to themselves for a while. They did not want rival countries to start to see their capacity for production ramp up the way that England's was. But one of the first questions that we've got to sort of ask ourselves is, why England? Why did the Industrial Revolution start there? One of the reasons that I think is worth thinking about or talking about, but I'm not going to get into much detail on it, is connected back to the scientific revolution. You'll remember Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was actually a philosopher and not a scientist, but when he formulated the scientific method, a lot of his goal was actually in regards to production. He wanted all of life to benefit from the power of science. And so, as Francis Bacon was English and formulated the scientific method in England, that way of thinking, the sort of practical, problem solving way of thinking that was meant to conquer and control, and I would say even exploit nature, that led to the Industrial Revolution there. But there's other reasons why England rather than somewhere else. So let's talk about it. Its beginnings in England. So one of the first things we see, besides what we've just talked about with the scientific revolution, is that prior to the recognizable industrial revolution, there was an increased ability to produce food. Little things that through the Middle Ages and into the modern era, they had done that made it possible for them to produce more food more easily. Some of it was machinery, some of it was understanding of planting patterns and things like that. But what that meant was less people had to be worried about food production. A smaller percentage of the society needed to be dedicated to producing food for that society. So they had other kinds of industries that could, or other kinds of businesses that could expand as people had more time to dedicate to other things. And also because they had more food, food cost less money. A smaller amount of their yearly income was dedicated to buying food, which meant they had extra money, and that meant they had increased demand for manufactured goods. They could spend their money on other things. So that's one thing. There's a greater demand for manufactured goods. So that means if somebody can figure out a way to produce more and sell more, they can make a lot more money. That's step one. Step two, because food production was getting better, and really because there were less issues with health and things like that, life expectancy was getting a little bit longer. That meant that with this increased population, you have increased urbanization as well. Not everybody had equal access to the land. Peasants didn't just work the land for a rich person anymore. They moved into the city, and so you have the urban poor. And what we end up needing then is to be able to produce more for those people, and then also ready-made working class. So what we end up is we sort of see this the necessary conditions. The necessary conditions for the Industrial Revolution in England are that there's a demand for better production, and there's a need for better production, more efficient production. There will be payoff. If somebody can find a way to produce more efficiently, there'll be a payoff. Besides that, England had all the ingredients that they needed, the requisite resources. One thing they had that turns out to be really necessary for the Industrial Revolution is capital. In this case, we're using the root of capitalism. So capital is associated with, for instance, money. There was enough money in England that people could invest capital, whether that meant to build a factory or to support an inventor as he's working on, an efficient piece of machinery. So the money needed for the job was in England. It was a prosperous country, getting more prosperous as the 1700s went on. Capital can also mean other things, like understanding and time and education, that sort of thing. But it also a lot of times means labor. You have capital if you have the ability to work. You have something to offer. And remember, with the increased population in England, you have increased labor available. Okay, so we're starting to see the sort of ground floor being placed in the Industrial Revolution. You have money, and you've got people to put to work, and you've got education, and you've got, all those things needed. More than that, the power sources for the early machinery were also available in England. They had a lot of coal. Now, they're not known for their coal production these days, necessarily, because there's been a lot of coal used up. But even through the mid-20th century, England was producing a lot of coal. And also they have a lot of swift-flowing rivers, and water power was one of the early sources for power for machinery. So they've got that. Then they've got the iron ore necessary to build the machinery, and iron ore will later be, necessary to steel production and all kinds of things. But here's maybe the key to all of it for England versus maybe a different country, and that is they had vast markets in which to sell their newly produced goods. Remember, in the mid-1700s, they still had the American colonies. Of course, they also had the Caribbean. They had connections to Egypt and far away as India. They had markets all around the world. And with these vast markets, that meant that they could produce almost endless amounts and still be able to sell it at a good price. So they're highly motivated to be able to make more efficient production because they'll never outstrip the demand. You might remember from Adam Smith that there's this concept of supply and demand and what's called the invisible hand of the economy, which says if you have high demand and low supply, you can charge a lot. And if you have low demand and high supply, you can't charge very much. But if you have a high demand and a high production, then you can sell a lot and make a lot of money. So having these markets was really important for England. So the roots, everything that was needed for the Industrial Revolution was available in England, and that's where it started. The industry that it started in was in cotton production. Cotton production was up to that point what you call a cottage industry, basically, small groups of people producing it and selling it to larger businesses who needed it, or even just tailors and seamstresses and people who are producing clothing on their own. But it's a two-step process. You need to be able to spin thread out of cotton, and you need to be able to weave cloth. And actually, there's even maybe a step before that, which is producing and refining the cotton itself, which will eventually become a part of the Industrial Revolution story too, because of the invention of the cotton gin. But what we're going to see here is that the first thing that they made more efficient was actually the weaving part. There was an invention of what was called the flying shuttle, and just meant that they had a loom, a weaving loom that was significantly more efficient, faster to weave cloth with. Of course, that meant that they could weave more cloth than they had thread to weave. So the next thing that happens, the second step, is what's called the spinning jenny was invented. And this made the spinning of thread more efficient. And now you're able to produce more thread and weave it more quickly. And that means more cloth is being produced all the time. The third step here is actually the invention of what was a water-powered loom. It's actually even more efficient than the flying shuttle. And it was invented by a man named Edmund Cartwright, and it's using those water wheels. You probably have been on like a field trip or something, or traveled with your family to see like an old-time mill set up with those water wheels turning. Well, Edmund Cartwright used that to power a loom, and that made it much more efficient. Now they're able to produce more and more cloth, which they can, of course, sell to their vast markets. And then the fourth step, which will actually take us into other industries, is the invention of the steam engine. Now, there are several people who deserve to get some credit for this story, but James Watt is maybe chief among them, as he, in a sense, perfects the steam engine. And what the steam engine will end up being able to do is power machinery, but also trains and even boats. And this means shipping will be really important and efficient now too. And so the efficiency, and basically from beginning to end of the process, is ramped up so that they are able to produce almost endless amounts of the good and sell it to their vast markets. The Industrial Revolution is getting started, but it starts with the textile industry, that is, making cloth. We'll pick up on that story tomorrow, and there'll be a worksheet due at the end of the week, just like we've done the last couple of weeks. Only 3 weeks to go. It's already May. You're doing great. Keep it up.